Excuse me. Yeah, I should have put this on.
Dropped along the mountains. A sharp rap might roll them back to Abu Dar, might even pin them there while they tried to figure out what he was up to. Or... There was something else, Moore said abruptly, rushing again. There was talk about some sort of Aes Sedai weapon. I found where it was used, a few miles from the city. The ground was all burned over, seared clean in the middle, a good 300 paces wide or more, and ruined orchards further. The sand was melted to sheets of glass. Saidin was worst there. Torvald waved a hand at him dismissively. There could have been Aes Sedai near when the city fell, yes? Or maybe the Shon-Chen themselves did it. One sister with an Angreal could... Rand cut in. What do you mean, Saidin was worst there? Dashiva moved, eyeing Moore oddly, reaching out to seize the young man. Rand fended him off roughly. What do you mean, Moore? Moore stared, mouth shut tight, running his thumb up and down the length of his sword hilt. The heat inside of him seemed ready to burst. There really was sweat beading on his face now. Saidin was... strange, he said hoarsely. His words came in rapid bursts. Worst there. I could feel it. In the air all around me, but strange everywhere around Abu Dar. And even 100 miles away. I had to fight it. Not like always. Different. Like it was alive. Sometimes it didn't want to do what I wanted. Sometimes it did something else. It did. I'm not mad. It did. The wind gusted, howling for a moment, shivering and snapping the tent walls, and Moore fell silent. Narishma's bells chimed a jerk of his head, then were still. That isn't possible, Dashiva muttered into the silence, but nearly under his breath. It is not possible. Who knows what's possible, Rand said. I don't. Do you? Dashiva's head came up in surprise, but Rand turned to Moore, moderating his tone. Don't worry, man. Not a mild tone. He could not manage that. Yet heartening, he hoped. His making, his responsibility. You'll be with me to the last battle. I promise it. The young man nodded and scrubbed at his face with his hand as though surprised to find it damp, but he glanced at Torvald, who had gone as still as stone. Did Moore know about the wine? It was a mercy, given the alternatives. A small and bitter mercy. Rand picked up Taim's missive, folded the page, and thrust it into his coat pocket. 1 in 50 mad already, and more to come. Was Moore next? Dashiva was surely close. Hopwell's stares took on a new meaning, and even Narishma's habitual quiet. Madness did not always mean screaming about spiders. He had asked once, warily, where he knew the answers would be true, how to cleanse the taint from Saidin, and got a riddle for answer. Herod Fell had claimed the riddle stated sound principles in both high philosophy and natural philosophy, but he had not seen any way to apply it to the problem at hand. Had Fell been killed because he might have puzzled out the riddle? Rand had a hint at the answer, or thought he might. I guess that could be disastrously wrong. Hints and riddles were not answers, yet he had to do something. If the taint was not cleansed somehow, Tom and Gaydon might find a world already ruined by madmen. What had to be done, had to be done. That would be wondrous, Torvald said in a near whisper. But how could anyone short of the Creator, or... He trailed off uneasily. Rand had not realized he had spoken any of his thoughts aloud. Narishma's eyes and Moore's and Hockwell's belonged in one face, shining with sudden hope. Dashiva looked poleaxed. Rand hoped he had not said too much. Some secrets had to be kept, including what he would do next. In short order, Hockwell was running for his horse to ride to the ridge with orders for the nobles, Moore and Dashiva to find Flynn and the other Ashaman, and Torvald was striding off to travel back to the Black Tower with commands for Taim. Narishma was last, and thinking of Aes Sedai and Seanchan and weapons, Rand sent him away as well, with careful instructions that made the young man's mouth tighten. Speak to no one, Rand finished softly, gripping Narishma's arm hard. And don't fail me. Not by a hair. I won't fail, Narishma said, unblinking. With a quick salute, he was gone too. Dangerous, a voice whispered in Rand's head. Oh, yes, very dangerous. Maybe too dangerous. But it might work. It might. In any event, you must kill Torvald now. You must. Wireman entered the council tent, shouldering aside Gregorin and Tolmeran, trying to shoulder aside Rosanna and Samaradrid, a lot of them eager to tell Rand that the men in the trees had decided wisely after all. They found him laughing till tears rolled down his face. Luz Theron had come back. Or else he really was mad already. Either way, it was reason to laugh.
Chapter 15. Stronger Than Written Law. In the dim, cold dark of deep night, Egwene woke groggily from restless sleep and troubling dreams, the more troubling because she could not remember them. Her dreams were always open to her, as clear as printed words on a page, yet these had been murky and fearful. She'd had too many of those lately. They left her wanting to run, to escape, never able to recall what from, but always queasy and uncertain, even trembling. At least her head was not hurting. At least she could recall the dreams she knew must be significant, though not how to interpret them. Rand, wearing different masks, until suddenly one of those false faces was no longer a mask, but him. Perrin and a tinker, frenziedly hacking their way through brambles with axe and sword, unaware of the cliff that lay just ahead. And the brambles screamed with human voices they did not hear. Matt, weighing 2 Aes Sedai on a huge set of balance scales, and on his decision depended... She could not say what. Something vast. The world, perhaps. There had been other dreams, most tinged with suffering. Recently, all of her dreams about Matt were pale and full of pain, like shadows cast by nightmares, almost as though Matt himself were not quite real. That made her afraid for him, left behind in Ebu Dar, and gave her agonies of grief for sending him there, not to mention poor old Tom Marilyn. But the unremembered dreams were worse, she was sure. The sound of low voices arguing had wakened her, and the full moon was still up outside, casting enough light for her to make out 2 women confronting one another at the tent's entrance. The poor woman's head pains her all day, and she gets little rest at night, Halima whispered fiercely, fists on her hips. Let this wait till morning. I don't propose to argue with you. Swan's voice was winter itself, and she tossed back her cloak with a mittened hand as though preparing to fight. She was dressed for the weather, in stout wool, no doubt worn over as many shifts as she could fit underneath. "You stand aside and right quick, or I'll have your guts for bait. And put on some decent clothes." With a soft laugh, Halima drew up, and if anything, planted herself more squarely in Swan's way. Her white nightgown clung, but was decent enough for its purpose, though it did seem a wonder she evaded freezing in that thin silk. The coals in the tripod braziers had died down long since, and neither much-mended tent canvas nor layered carpets on the ground held in warmth any longer. Both women's breath was pale mist. Throwing off the blankets, Egwene sat up wearily on her narrow cot. Halima was a countrywoman with a skim of sophistication, and often she did not seem to realize the deference due to Aes Sedai, or indeed seem to think she need defer to anyone. She spoke to sitters as she might to the goodwives in her own village, with a laugh and a level eye and a straightforward earthiness that sometimes shocked. Swan spent her days giving way to women who had jumped at her word a year earlier, smiling and curtsying for nearly every sister in the camp. Many still laid much of the tower's troubles at her feet, and thought she had hardly suffered enough to atone, sufficient to keep anyone's pride at a stiff prickle. Together, the pair were a lantern tossed into the back of an illuminator's wagon, but Egwene hoped to avoid an explosion. Besides, Swan would not have come in the middle of the night unless it was necessary. "Go back to bed, Halima." Smothering a yawn, Egwene bent to fumble her shoes and stockings from beneath the cot. She did not channel a lamp alight. Better if no one noticed that the Amyrlin was awake. "Go on. You need your rest." Halima protested, perhaps more strongly than she should have, to the Amyrlin seat, but soon enough she was back on the tiny cot that had been squeezed into the tent for her. Very little room remained to move in, with a washstand, a stand mirror, and a real armchair, plus 4 large chests stacked atop one another. Those held the constant flow of clothes from sitters who had not yet realized that however young Egwene might be, she was not young enough to be dazzled or diverted by silks and laces. Halima lay curled up, watching in the darkness, while Egwene hastily dragged an ivory comb through her hair, donned stout mittens, and pulled a fox-lined cloak over her nightgown. A thick woolen nightgown, and she would not have minded thicker in this weather. Halima's eyes seemed to pick up the faint moonlight and shine darkly, unblinking. Egwene did not think the woman jealous of her place near the Amyrlin seat, casual as it was, and the light knew she did not carry gossip. But Halima had an innocent curiosity about everything, whether or not it was any of her business. Reason enough to hear Swan out elsewhere. Everyone knew now that Swan had thrown in her lot with Egwene after a fashion, as they thought, sullenly and grudgingly. A figure of some amusement and occasional pity, Swan Sanche reduced to attaching herself to the woman who held the title once hers, and that woman no more than a puppet once the hall finished fighting over who would pull her cords. Swan was human enough to harbor sparks of resentment, but so far they had managed to keep secret that her advice was far from grudging. So she endured pity and snickers as best she could, and everyone believed her as changed by her experiences as her face. That belief had to be maintained, or Romanda and Lilane, and very likely the rest of the hall too, would find ways to separate her, and her advice, from Egwene. The cold outside slapped Egwene in the face and flooded under her cloak. Her nightgown might as well have been Halima's for all the protection it offered. Despite stout leather and good wool, her feet felt as if they were bare. Tendrils of frosty air curled around her ears, mocking the thick fur lining her hood. Yearning for her bed as she was, ignoring the iciness took all the concentration she could muster. Clouds scudded across the sky, and moon shadows floated over the gleaming white that covered the ground, a smooth sheet broken by the dark mounds of tents and the taller shapes of canvas-topped wagons that now had long wooden runners in place of wheels. Many of the wagons were no longer parked apart from the tents, but left where they had been unloaded. No one had the heart to make the wagon drivers put out even that much extra effort at the end of the day. Nothing moved, except those pale sliding shadows. The wide runnels that had been trampled through the camp for paths lay empty. The silence was crisp and so deep that she almost regretted breaking it. "What is it?" she asked softly, casting a wary glance at the small tent nearby shared by her maids, Chesa, Mary, and Selene. That was as still and dark as the others. Exhaustion made as thick a blanket over the camp as the snow. "Not another revelation like the kin, I hope." She clicked her tongue in vexation. She was spent, too, by long freezing days in the saddle and not enough real sleep, or she would not have said that. "I'm sorry, Swan." "No need to apologize, Mother." Swan kept her voice down as well and glanced about to see whether anyone might be watching from the shadows besides. Neither wanted to find herself discussing the kin with the hall. "I know I should have told you beforehand, but it seemed a small thing. I never expected those girls to even speak to one of them. There's so much to tell you. I have to try to pick and choose what's important." With an effort, Egwene managed not to sigh. That was almost word for word the apology Swan had offered before, several times. What she meant was that she was trying to force-feed Egwene over 20 years of experience as Aes Sedai, more than 10 of that as Amyrlin, and do it in months. At times, Egwene felt like a goose being fattened for market. "Well, what's important tonight?" "Gareth Bryn's waiting in your study." Swan did not raise her voice, but it took on an edge, as always when she spoke of Lord Bryn. She tossed her head angrily inside the deep hood of her cloak and made a sound like a cat spitting. "The man came in dripping snow, scooped me out of my bedding, and barely gave me time to dress before hauling me up behind his saddle. He told me nothing, just tossed me down at the edge of camp and sent me to fetch you like I was a serving girl." Firmly, Egwene stifled a rising hope. There had been too many disappointments, and whatever had brought Bryn in the middle of the night was much more likely to be a potential disaster than what she wished for. How far yet to the border with Andor? "Let's see what he wants." Starting off toward the tent everyone named the Amyrlin study, she held her cloak close. She did not shiver, but refusing to let heat or cold touch you did not make them go away. You could ignore them right up to the moment sunstroke cooked your brain or frostbite rotted your hands and feet. She considered what Swan had said. "You weren't sleeping in your own tent here?" she said carefully. The other woman's relation to Lord Bryn was that of a servant in a very peculiar way, but Egwene hoped Swan was not letting her stubborn pride lead her into letting him take advantage. She could not imagine it, of him or her, yet not so long ago she could not have imagined Swan accepting any part of the situation. She still could not understand why. Snorting loudly, Swan kicked her skirts, and nearly fell as her shoes skidded. Snow, beaten down by countless feet, had quickly become a rough sheet of ice. Egwene was picking her own way cautiously. Every day brought broken bones that travel-weary sisters had to heal. Half abandoning her cloak, she offered an arm as much for the support she might receive as give. Swan took it, muttering. By the time I finished cleaning the man's spare boots and second saddle, it was too late to tramp back through this. Not that he offered more than blankets in a corner, not Gareth Bryn. Made me dig them out of the chest myself, while he went off the light knows where. Men are a trial, and that one the worst. Without a pause for breath, she changed the subject. You shouldn't let that Halima sleep in your tent. She's another pair of ears you have to be careful of, and snoopy with it. Besides, you're lucky you don't walk in to find her entertaining some soldier. I am very glad that Delana can spare Halima nights, Egwene said firmly. I need her, unless you think Misal's healing might do better with my headaches the second time around. Halima's fingers seemed to draw the pain out through her scalp. Without that, she would not be able to sleep at all. Misal's effort had had no effect whatsoever, and she was the only yellow Egwene dared approach with the problem. As for the rest... She made her voice sterner still. I am surprised you're still listening to that gossip, daughter. The fact that men like looking at a woman doesn't mean she invites it, as you should know well. I've seen more than a few looking at you and grinning. Taking that tone came easier than it once had. Swan gave her a startled sidelong glance, and after a moment grumbled an apology. It might have been sincere. Egwene accepted it either way. Lord Bryn was very bad for Swan's temper, and tossing Halima into the bargain, Egwene thought it a good job she was not pushed into taking a stricter stance. Swan herself had said that she should not put up with nonsense, and she surely could not afford to put up with it from Swan, of all people. Trudging arm in arm, they went on in silence, the cold fogging their breath and seeping through their flesh. The snow was a curse and a lesson. She could still hear Swan going on about what she called the law of unintended consequences, stronger than any written law. Whether or not what you do has the effect you want, it will have three at least you never expected, and one of those usually unpleasant. The first feeble rains had brought astonishment, for all Egwene had already informed the hall that the Bowl of the Winds had been found and used. That was almost as much as she could risk letting them know of what Elaine had told her in Tel Riod. Too much of what had happened in Ebudar was just the thing to cut her feet out from under her here, and her position was precarious enough as it was. An explosion of joy erupted at those first sprinkles. They had halted the march at midday, and there had been bonfires and feasting in the drizzle, prayers of thanksgiving among the sisters, and dancing among the servants and the soldiers. For that matter, some of the Aes Sedai had danced, too. A few days later, the soft rains became downpours, and then howling tempests. The temperature slid downward, plummeted, and tempests became blizzards. Now, the distance once covered in a day, with Egwene gritting her teeth over how slowly they moved, took 5 when the sky held only clouds, and when the snows fell, they did not move at all. Easy enough to think of 3 unintended consequences or more, and the snow might well be the least unpleasant. As they approached the small patched tent called the Amerlin's study, a shadow moved beside one of the tall wagons, and Egwene's breath caught. The shadow became a figure who slipped back her hood enough to reveal Lyanna's face, then pulled back into darkness. "She'll keep a watch and let us know if anybody comes," Swan said softly. "That's good," Egwene muttered. The woman could have told her in advance. She had half been afraid it was Romanda or Lelaine. The Amerlin's study was dark, but Lord Bryn stood waiting patiently inside, wrapped in his cloak, a shadow among shadows. Embracing the source, Egwene channeled, not to light the lantern hanging from the center pole or one of the candles, but to make a small sphere of pale light that she suspended in the air over the folding table she used as a writing desk. Very small and very pale, unlikely to be noticed from outside, and quick as thought to extinguish. She could not afford discovery. There had been Amerlins who reigned in strength, Amerlins who managed an even balance with the hall, and Amerlins who had had as little power as she, or less upon rare occasions, well hidden in the secret histories of the White Tower. Several had frittered away power and influence, falling from strength to weakness, but in over 3,000 years, precious few had managed to move in the other direction. Egwene very much wished she knew how Miriam Copan and the rest of that bare handful had managed. If anyone had ever thought to write that down, the pages were long lost. Bowing respectfully, Bryn showed no surprise at her caution. He knew what she put at hazard, meeting him secretly. To a very large degree, she trusted this sturdy, heavily graying man with the bluff, weathered face, and not only because she had to. His cloak was thick red wool, lined with marten and bordered with the flame of Tarvalon, a gift from the hall. Yet he had made plain a dozen times in the past weeks that whatever the hall thought, and he was not blind enough to have missed that, she was the Amerlin, and he followed the Amerlin. Oh, he had never said so right out, but with carefully worded hints that left no doubt. Expecting more would have been expecting too much. There were nearly as many undercurrents in the camp as there were Aes Sedai, some strong enough to pull him down, several strong enough to mire her deeper than she was, if the hall learned of this meeting. She trusted him further than anyone except Swan and Lyanna, or Elaine and Nynaeve, maybe further than any of the sisters who had sworn fealty to her in secret, and she wished she had the courage to trust him more. The ball of white light cast weak, fitful shadows. "You have news, Lord Bryn?" she asked, stifling hope. She could think of a dozen possible messages that might bring him in the night, each with its own set of pitfalls and snares. Had Rand decided to add more crowns to that of Ilion? Or the Shan-Chan somehow captured still another city? Or the Band of the Red Hand suddenly moved on its own instead of shadowing the Aes Sedai? Or... "An army lies north of us, Mother," he replied calmly. His leather-gauntleted hands rested lightly atop his long sword hilt. "An army to the north, a little more snow, all the same. Andorans mainly, but with a goodly number of Murandians. My deep scouts brought the news less than an hour ago. Pelivar leads, and Arathel is with him. The high seats of two of the strongest houses in Andor, and they've brought 20 more at least. They're pushing south hard, it seems. If you keep on as you are, which I advise against, we should meet head-on in 2 days, 3 at the outside." Egwene kept her face smooth, suppressing her relief. What she had been hoping for, waiting for, what she had begun to fear, might never come. Surprisingly, it was Swan who gasped and clapped a mittened hand over her mouth. Bryn cocked an eyebrow at her, but she recovered quickly, putting on Aes Sedai serenity so thick you almost forgot her youthful face. "Do you have qualms at fighting your fellow Andorans?" she demanded. "Speak up, man. I'm not your watchwoman here." There was a small crack in that serenity. "As you command, Swan Sedai." Bryn's tone held no scrap of mockery, yet Swan's mouth began to tighten, her outward coolness evaporating fast. He made her a small bow, workmanlike but acceptable. "I will fight whoever the Mother wishes me to fight, of course." Even here, he would not be more forthcoming. Men learned caution around Aes Sedai. So did women. Egwene thought caution had become a second skin for her. "And if we don't keep on?" she said. So much planning, just her and Swan and sometimes Lyanna, and now she still had to feel out each step as carefully as on those icy paths outside. "If we stop here?" He did not hesitate. "If you have a way to bring them around without fighting, all well and good. But sometime tomorrow they'll reach an excellent position to defend, one flank held by the river Arman, the other by a large peat bog, and small streams in front to break up attacks. Pelivar will settle in there to wait. He knows the work. Arathel will have her part if there's talking, but she'll leave the pikes and swords to him. We can't reach it ahead of him, and anyway, the terrain is no use to us there, with him to the north. If you mean to fight, I advise making for that ridge we crossed 2 days back. We can reach it in good order ahead of them if we start at dawn, and Pelivar would think twice about coming at us there if he had 3 times the numbers he does." Wriggling near frozen toes inside her stockings, Egwene let out an annoyed sigh. There was a difference between not letting cold touch you and not feeling it. Picking her way carefully, not letting herself be distracted by the chill, she asked, "Will they talk, offered the chance?" "Probably, Mother. The Murandians hardly count. They're just there for whatever advantage they can wring out of the situation, same as their countrymen under me. It's Pelivar and Arathel who matter. If I had to wager, I'd say they only mean to keep you out of Andor." He shook his head grimly. "But they'll fight if they have to, if they must, maybe even if it means facing Aes Sedai instead of just soldiers. I expect they've heard the same tales we have about that battle out east somewhere." "Fish guts," Swan growled. So much for calm. "Half-baked rumors and raw gossip are no proof there was any battle, you lummox. And if there was, sisters wouldn't have gotten themselves mixed up in it." The man truly was an occasion of sin for her. Strangely, Bryn smiled. He often did when Swan showed her temper. Anywhere else, on anyone else, Egwene would have called the smile fond. "Better for us, if they believe," he told Swan mildly. Her face darkened so you might have thought he had sneered at her. Why did a normally sensible woman let Bryn get under her skin? Whatever the reason, Egwene had no time for it tonight. "Swan, I see someone forgot to take away the mulled wine. It can't have soured in this weather. Warm it for us, please." She did not like setting the other woman down in front of Bryn, but she had to be reined in, and this seemed the gentlest way to do it. Really, they should not have left the silver pitcher on her table. Swan did not quite flinch, but from her stricken expression, quickly smoothed over, You would never have believed she washed the man's small clothes.
Hey, D-Man,
Without
how you
comment,
doing,
she
bro?
channeled slightly to reheat the wine in the silver pitcher, quickly filled 2 clean
How you
worked
been
silver
doing?
cups, and handed the first to Egwene. She kept the second, staring at Lord Bryn as she sipped, and leaving him to pour for himself.
Happy Thanksgiving to you too,
Warming her
bro.
mittened fingers on her own cup, Egwene felt a flash of irritation. Maybe it was part of Swan's long-delayed reaction to the death of her warder.
Yeah, we had
She
to
still became weepy for no visible reason now
eat
and then, though
turkey
she
at a
tried
couple
to hide
places
it.
tomorrow.
Egwene put the
Because we
matter
got
out of her head. Tonight, that was
a
an
turkey that
anthill
we're gonna
beside
do.
mountains.
Hell
I
yeah,
want to
D-Man.
avoid a battle if I can,
And
Lord
then we're
Bryn.
going to our
The army is
mom's.
for Tarvalon, not fighting a war
And at her
here.
mom's,
Send to arrange a meeting as soon as possible for the Amerlin seat with Lord
she's gonna
Pelavar
have
and Lady
turkey,
Arafel and
ham,
anyone else you think should be
and
present. Not here.
tamales.
Our ragged camp won't impress them very much. As soon as possible, mind. I wouldn't object to tomorrow if it could be set. That's sooner than I can manage, Mother, he said mildly. If I send riders out as soon as I return to camp, I doubt they can be back with an answer much before tomorrow night. Then I suggest you return quickly. Light, but her hands and feet felt cold, and the pit of her stomach, too. But her voice kept its calm. And I want you to keep that meeting and the existence of their army from the hall as long as possible. This time she was asking him to take as great a risk as she did. Gareth Bryn was one of the best generals living, but the hall chafed that he did not run the army to suit them. They had been grateful for his name in the beginning, for it helped draw soldiers to their cause. Now the army had more than 30,000 armed men, with more coming even since the snows had started, and they thought that maybe they did not need Lord Gareth Bryn any longer. And, of course, there were those who believed they never had needed him. They would not simply send him away for this. If the hall chose to act, he might well go to the headsman for treason. He did not blink, and he did not ask questions. Perhaps he knew he would not give answers. Or maybe he thought he knew them. There isn't much traffic between my camp, but too many men know already to keep a secret long. I will do what I can, though. As simple as that. The first step down a road that would see her on the Amerlin seat in Tarvalon, or else deliver her firmly into the grasp of the hall with nothing left to decide except whether it was Romanda or Lelaine who told her what to do. Somehow such a pivotal moment should have been accompanied by fanfares of trumpets, or at the least, thunder in the sky. It was always that way in stories. Egwene let the ball of light vanish, but as Bryn turned to leave, she caught his arm. It was like catching a thick tree branch through his coat. A thing I have been meaning to ask you, Lord Bryn. You can't want to take men worn down by marching right into a siege of Tarvalon. How long would you want to rest them before you began? For the first time he paused, and she wished she still had the light to see his face. She thought he frowned. Even leaving people in the pay of the tower out of it, he said at last, slowly. News of an army flies as fast as a falcon. Elida will know to the day when we'll arrive, and she won't give us an hour. You know she's increasing the tower guard? To 50,000 men, apparently. But a month, if I could, to rest and recover. 10 days would do, but a month would be better. She nodded, releasing him. That casual question about the tower guard hurt. He was aware that the hall and the Ajahs told her what they wanted her to know, and no more. I suppose you're right, she said evenly. There'll be no time for rest once we reach Tarvalon. Send your fastest riders.
Still working on
There
this
won't be
one,
another
gotten it
battle,
down
will there?
a little
Pelavar
bit.
and Arafel will hear them out. She did not feign the
This
touch of
one,
anxiety.
not as much.
More than her plans might be ruined if they had to fight now.
I've been working on it.
Bryn's tone did not alter a whit that she could tell, but somehow he sounded soothing. So long as there is light enough for them to see the white feathers, they'll recognize a truce and listen. I'd better go now. It's a long way and hard riding, even for men with extra horses. As soon as the tent flap fell behind him, Egwene let out a long breath. Her shoulders were tight, and she expected her head to start aching any moment. Bryn usually made her feel relaxed, absorbing his sureness. Tonight she had had to manipulate him, and she thought he knew it. He was very observant for a man. but too much was at stake to trust him more until he made an open declaration. Maybe an oath like the one Mirella and the others had given. Bryn followed the Amerlin, and the army followed Bryn. If he thought she was going to throw men away uselessly, a few words from him could hand her to the hall trussed like a pig on a platter. She drank deeply, feeling the warmth of the spiced wine spread through her. "Better for us if they believed," she muttered. "I wish there was something for them to believe. If I do nothing else, Swan, I hope at least I can free us from the 3 oaths." "No!" Swan barked. She sounded scandalized. "Even trying could be disastrous, and if you succeeded, the light help us, if you succeeded, you would destroy the White Tower." "What are you talking about?" "I try to follow the oaths, Swan, if we're stuck with them. But the oaths won't help us against the Shanshire. If sisters have to be in danger of their lives before they can fight back, it's only a matter of time before we are all dead or collared." For a moment she could feel the eidam around her throat again, turning her into a dog on a leash, a well-trained and obedient dog. She was glad of the darkness now, hiding her trembles. Shadows obscured Swan's face, save for a soundlessly working jaw. "Don't you look at me like that, Swan." It was easier to be angry than afraid. Easy to mask fear in anger. She would never be collared like that again. "You've taken every advantage since you were freed from the oaths. If you hadn't lied in your teeth, we'd all be in Salidar without an army, sitting on our hands and waiting for a miracle. Well, you would be. They'd never have summoned me to be Amerlin without your lie about Logain and the Reds. Elida would reign supreme, and in a year nobody would remember how she usurped the Amerlin seat. She'd destroy the tower for sure. You know she'd mishandle everything about Ram. I would not be surprised if she had tried to kidnap him by now, except that she's concerned with us. Well, maybe not kidnap, but she'd have done something. Likely Aes Sedai would be fighting Ashaman today, and never mind Tarman Gaiden waiting over the horizon." "I have lied when it seemed necessary," Swan breathed, "when it seemed expedient." Her shoulders hunched, and she sounded as though she were confessing crimes she did not want to admit to herself. "Sometimes I think it's become too easy for me to decide that it's necessary and expedient. I've lied to almost everyone, except you. But don't think it hasn't occurred to me, to nudge you toward a decision or away from one. It wasn't wanting to keep your trust that stopped me." Swan's hand stretched out in the dark, pleading. "The light knows what your trust and friendship mean to me, but it wasn't that. It wasn't knowing that you'd have the hide off me in strips or send me away if you found out. I realized that I had to hold on to the oaths with somebody, or I'd lose myself completely. So I don't lie to you or to Gareth Bryn, whatever it costs. And as soon as I can, Mother, I will swear the 3 oaths on the oath rod again." "Why?" Egwene asked. Swan had considered lying to her. She would have been happy for that. But her anger was gone. "I don't condone it normally. It's just that sometimes it really is necessary." Her time with the Aiel flashed through her mind. "So long as you're willing to pay for it, anyway. I've seen sisters take on penance for smaller things. You are one of the first of a new sort of Aes Sedai, Swan, free and unbound. I believe you when you say you won't lie to me." "Or to Lord Bryn? Odd, that. Why give up your freedom?" "Give up?" Swan laughed. "I'll be giving up nothing." Her back straightened, and her voice began to gain strength, and then passion. "The oaths are what make us more than simply a group of women meddling in the affairs of the world, or 7 groups, or 50. The oaths hold us together, a stated set of beliefs that bind us all, a single thread running through every sister, living or dead, back to the first to lay her hands on the oath rod. They are what make us Aes Sedai, not Saidar. Any wilder can channel. Men may look at what we say from 6 sides, but when a sister says, 'This is so,' they know it's true, and they trust. Because of the oaths. Because of the oaths, no queen fears that sisters will lay waste to her cities. The worst villain knows he's safe in his life with a sister unless he tries to harm her. Oh, the White Cloaks call them lies, and some people have strange ideas about what the oaths entail, but there are very few places an Aes Sedai cannot go and be listened to because of the oaths. The 3 oaths are what it is to be Aes Sedai, the heart of being Aes Sedai. Throw that on the rubbish heap and we'll be sand washing away in the tide. Give up? I will be gaining. Egwene frowned. And the Shan-Chan? What it was to be Aes Sedai. Almost from the day she first arrived in Tar Valon, she had worked to be Aes Sedai, but she had never really thought about what it was that made a woman Aes Sedai. Once more, Swan laughed, though this time it was a touch wry and weary. She shook her head, and darkness or no, looked tired. I don't know, Mother. The light help me, I don't. But we survived the Trolloc Wars, and White Cloaks, and Arthur Hawkwing, and everything in between. We can find a way to deal with these Shan-Chan, without destroying ourselves. Egwene was not so sure. Many of the sisters in camp thought the Shan-Chan were such a danger that besieging Elida should wait, as if waiting would not cement Elida on the Amerlin seat. Many others seemed to think that simply uniting the White Tower again at whatever price would make the Shan-Chan vanish. Survival lost some of its attraction, if it was survival on a leash, and Elida's would not be much less confining than the Shan-Chan's. What it was to be Aes Sedai. There's no need to keep Gareth Bryn at arm's length, Swan said suddenly. The man's a walking tribulation, it's true. If he doesn't count as penance for my lies, being flayed alive, one of these days I'll box his ears every morning and kill his evenings on general principle. But you can tell him everything. It would help if he understood. He's taking you on trust, and it ties his stomach in knots, wondering whether you know what you're doing. He doesn't let on, but I see. Suddenly, pieces clicked in Egwene's mind like a blacksmith's puzzle coming undone. Shocking pieces. Swan was in love with the man. Nothing else made sense. Everything she knew between them altered, not necessarily for the better. A woman in love often put her brains on the shelf when she was around the man in question, as she herself was all too well aware. Where was Gawain? Was he well? Was he warm? Enough of that. Too much in light of what she had to say. She put on her best Amerlin's voice, sure and in command. You can box Lord Bryn's ears or bed him, Swan, but you will watch yourself with him. You will not let slip things he mustn't know yet. Do you understand me? Swan jerked stiffly erect. I'm not in the habit of letting my tongue flap like a torn sail, Mother, she said heatedly. I'm very glad to hear it, Swan. Despite being only a few years apart, Swan was old enough to be her mother, yet at that moment Egwene felt as though their ages had been reversed. This might be the first time that Swan had ever had to manage with a man not as Aes Sedai, but as a woman. A few years of thinking I loved Rand, Egwene thought wryly. A few months of dangling by my toes for God, I don't know all there is to know. Down here, she went on, slipping an arm through the frame. Almost. Come. The walls of the tent had seemed little protection, yet stepping outside brought a renewed assault by winter's teeth. The moonlight was almost bright enough to read by, reflected off the snow, but that glow seemed cold. Bryn had vanished as if he had never been. Lyanna appeared long enough to say she had seen no one, her slimness swallowed in layers of wool, then hurried off into the night looking about her. No one knew of any connection between Lyanna and Egwene, and everyone thought Lyanna and Swan were practically at daggers' points. Gathering her cloak as best she could one-handed, Egwene focused on ignoring the icy chill as she and Swan walked in the opposite direction from Lyanna. Ignoring the chill and keeping an eye out for anyone who happened to be out. Not that anyone who was outside now was likely to be there by happenstance. Lord Bryn was right, she told Swan, about it being better if Pelivar and Arathel believed those stories, or at least if they were uncertain. Too uncertain to fight or do anything except talk. Do you think they would welcome a visit from Aes Sedai? Swan, are you listening to me? Swan gave a start and stopped staring into the distance ahead of them. She'd been walking ahead without missing a step, but now she slipped and nearly sat down in the frozen path. barely regaining her balance in time to keep from pulling Egwene down. Yes, Mother. Of course I'm listening. They might not be exactly welcoming, but I doubt they'll turn sisters away. Then I want you to wake Beonin, Anaya, and Mirella. They are to ride north inside the hour. If Lord Bryn expects a reply as soon as tomorrow evening, time is short. A pity she had not found out exactly where this other army was located, but asking Bryn might have roused suspicion. Finding it should not be too hard for warders, and those three sisters had 5 between them. Swan listened in silence to her instructions. Not only those 3 were to be rooted out of their sleep. Come dawn, Shiriam and Carlinia, Morvrin and Nisau would all know what to say over breakfast. Seeds had to be planted, seeds that could not have been placed earlier for fear of them sprouting too soon, but now they had all too little time to grow. It will be a pleasure to haul them out of their blankets, Swan said when she was done. If I have to tramp around in this... Releasing Egwene's arm, she started to turn away, then stopped, her face serious, even grim. I know you want to be a second Gera Kishar, or maybe Sorela Bagand. You have it in you to match either. But be careful you don't turn out to be another Shine Chunla. Good night, Mother. Sleep well. Egwene stood watching her go, a cloak-shrouded figure sometimes skidding on the path and muttering angrily, almost loud enough to make out. Gera and Sorela were remembered as among the greatest Amerlins. Both had raised the influence and prestige of the White Tower to levels seldom equaled since before Arthur Hawkwing. Both controlled the tower itself, too. Gera by skillfully playing one faction in the hall against another, Sorela by the sheer force of her will. Sign Chunla was another matter, one who had squandered the power of the Amerlin seat, alienating most of the sisters in the tower. The world believed that Shine had died in office, close on 400 years ago, but the deeply hidden truth was that she had been deposed and sent into exile for life. Even the secret histories treaded lightly in certain areas, yet it was fairly obvious that after the 4th plot to restore her to the Amerlin seat was uncovered, the sisters guarding Shine had smothered her in her sleep with a pillow. Egwene shivered and told herself it was the cold. Turning, she began making her slow way back to her tent alone. Sleep well? The fat moon hung low in the sky, and there were hours yet till sunrise, but she was not sure she was going to be able to sleep at all. Chapter 16. Unexpected Absences. Before the sun made a rim on the horizon the next morning, Egwene convened the hall of the tower. In Tar Valon, that would have been accompanied by considerable ceremony, and even since leaving Salidar they had held to some, despite the difficulties of travel. Now Shiriam simply went from sitter's tent to sitter's tent while it was still dark, to announce that the Amerlin seat had called the hall to sit. In fact, they did not sit at all. In the grayness just before true sunrise, 18 women stood in a semicircle on the snow to hear Egwene, all bundled against the cold that misted their breath. Other sisters began appearing behind them to listen, only a few at the start, but when no one told them to leave, the group thickened and spread out to a soft buzz of talk. A very muted buzz. Few sisters would risk bothering a lone sitter, much less the entire hall. The accepted in banded dresses and cloaks who had appeared behind the Aes Sedai were quieter, of course, and even quieter the gathering novices who had no chores, though there were a good many more of them. The camp now held half again as many novices as sisters, so many that few possessed a proper white cloak, and most made do with a simple white skirt instead of a novice dress. Some sisters still believed they should go back to the old ways and let girls seek them out, but most regretted the lost years, when Aes Sedai numbers dwindled. Egwene herself almost shivered whenever she thought of what the tower could have been. This was one change not even Swan could object to. In the midst of all the gathering, Carlinia came around the corner of a tent and stopped short at the sight of Egwene and the sitters. Normally composure to her toenails, the white sister gaped, and her pale face reddened before she hurried away, looking back over her shoulder. Egwene stifled a grimace. Everyone was too concerned with what she herself was about this morning to have noticed, but sooner or later someone was going to, and wonder. Flinging back her delicately embroidered cloak to reveal the narrow blue stole of the keeper, Shiriam made Egwene as much of a formal curtsy as her bulky garments allowed, before taking a place at her side. Wrapped in layers of fine wool and silk, the flame-haired woman was a picture of equanimity. At Egwene's nod, she took one step forward to intone the ancient formula in a clear, high voice. "She comes! She comes! The Watcher of the Seals, the Flame of Tar Valon, the Amerlin Seat. Attend you all, for she comes." It seemed a little out of place here, and besides, she was already there, not coming. The sitters stood in silence, waiting. A few frowned impatiently or fiddled restlessly with cloaks or skirts. Egwene pushed back her own cloak, uncovering the 7-striped stole draped around her neck. These women needed any reminder she could give that she was indeed the Amerlin Seat. "Everyone is weary from travel in this weather," she announced, not quite so loudly as Shiriam, but loud enough that everyone could hear. She felt a tingle of anticipation, an almost light-headed thrill. It was not much different from being queasy. "I have decided to stop here for 2 days, perhaps 3. That brought heads up and sparked interest. She hoped Swan was in the listening crowd. She did try to hold to the oaths. "The horses need rest, too, and many of the wagons badly need repairs. The keeper will see to the necessary arrangements." It truly was begun now. She
Big
expected
right
neither argument nor discussion, and there was none. What she had told Swan was no exaggeration. Too many sisters hoped for a miracle, so they would not have to march on Tar Valon with the world watching. Even among those convinced in their souls that Elida must be ousted for the good of the Tower, despite everything they had done, too many would grasp any chance of delay, any chance for that miracle to appear. One of those last, Romanda, did not wait for Shiriam to speak the closing lines. As soon as Egwene finished speaking, Romanda, looking quite youthful with her tight gray bun hidden by her hood, simply strode away. Cloaks flapping, Magla, Saroya, and Varlin scurried after her. As well as anyone could scurry, when every other step sank ankle-deep. They did a good job of it anyway. Sitters or no, they hardly seemed to breathe without Romanda's permission. When Lilane saw Romanda leaving, she gathered up Faisella, Takima, and Lirella from the semicircle with a gesture and went without a backward glance, like a swan with 3 anxious goslings. If they were not so firmly in Lilane's grasp as the other 3 were in Romanda's, they did not fall far short. For that matter, the rest of the sitters barely waited on the final "depart now in the light" to leave Shiriam's lips. Egwene turned to go with her Hall of the Tower already scattering in every direction. That tingle was stronger, and very like being queasy. 3 days, Shiriam murmured, offering Egwene a hand to help her down into one of the rutted paths. The corners of her tilted green eyes crinkled quizzically. "I'm surprised, Mother. Forgive me, but you dug in your heels nearly every time I wanted to stop for more than one." "Speak to me again after you've talked to the wheelwrights and farriers," Egwene told her. "We'll not go far with horses dropping dead and wagons falling apart." "As you say, Mother," the other woman replied, not precisely meekly, but in perfect acceptance. The footing was no better now than it had been the night before, and their steps sometimes slid. Linking arms, they walked on slowly. Shiriam offered more support than Egwene required, but she did so almost surreptitiously. The Amerlin Seat should not fall on her bottom in the full view of 50 sisters and 100 servants, but neither should she seem propped up like an invalid. Most of the sitters who had sworn to Egwene, Shiriam included, had done so out of simple fear, really, and self-preservation. If the Hall learned they had sent sisters to sway the Aes Sedai in Tar Valon, and worse, kept the fact from the Hall for fear of dark friends among the sitters, they surely and certainly would spend the rest of their lives in penance and exile. So the women who had believed they could somehow twitch Egwene about like a puppet, after the greater part of their influence with the Hall melted, instead found themselves sworn
Hey,
to
Green
obey her.
Queen, how you doing?
That was rare,
Hope you're
even in the
doing
secret
good.
histories. Sisters were expected to obey the Armelin, but swearing fealty was something else again. Most still seemed unsettled by it, though they did obey. Few were as bad as Carlinia, but Egwene had actually heard Beonin's teeth chatter the first time she saw Egwene with sitters after swearing. Morvrin looked astonished anew whenever her eyes fell on
Just
Egwene, as if
hitting
she
my
still
little
did not quite believe.
3.5
And
gram
Lisao hardly seemed to stop
THC
frowning.
cart.
Anaya clicked her tongue over the
How you
secrecy,
been doing,
and
Green
Mirella
Queen?
often flinched, though for more reason than taking an oath. But Shiriam simply had settled into the role of Egwene's keeper of the chronicles in truth, not just name. May I suggest using this opportunity to see what the surrounding country offers in way of food and fodder, Mother? Our stocks are low, Shiriam frowned anxiously. Especially tea and salt,
Just playing
though I
a
doubt we'll find
game real
those.
quick too.
Do
See if I
what you
can get it
can,
up.
Egwene said in a soothing tone. Odd now to think that once she had gone in awe of Shiriam, and in no little fear of her displeasure.
Playing a
Strange as it seemed,
Raid
now
Shadow
that she was no
Legends.
longer mistress of novices, no longer trying
Been
to tug
playing
and
it
push
for
Egwene to do as she wished.
a good little
Shiriam
while.
actually seemed happier. I have every confidence in you, Shiriam. The woman positively beamed at the compliment.
Because I got this cart too.
The sun still
That's
did not show
also
above the tents
3.5
and
grammer.
wagons to the east, but the camp was already bustling, in a manner of
I have my
speaking.
bowl loaded too. I
Breakfast
just
done, the cooks were cleaning up,
haven't
helped by a horde of novices. From the
got
vigor they
around
put into
to
it, the young women seemed to find some warmth in scrubbing kettles with snow, but the cooks moved laboriously, knuckling their backs, stopping to sigh and sometimes to pull their cloaks close and stare bleakly at the snow. Shivering serving men, wearing most of the clothes they owned, had begun striking tents and loading wagons automatically as soon as they finished their hasty meal, and were now stumbling about to raise the tents and haul chests out of the wagons. Animals that had been being hunted were now being led away by weary horse handlers who walked with heads down. Again, heard a few grumbles from men who failed to notice there were sisters nearby, but the greater number seemed inclined to voice a complaint. Most of the Aes Sedai whose tents were
That
up
one
had
hurt a little
vanished
bit.
inside, but a good many still directed workers, and others hurried along the sunken paths on errands of their own. Unlike everyone else, they showed as little outward weariness as the warders, who somehow managed to appear as if they had had all the sleep they needed for this fine spring day. Egwene suspected that was a real part of how a sister drew strength from her warder, quite aside from what she could do with the bond. When your warder would not admit to himself that he was cold or tired or hungry, you just had to bear up as well. On one of the crossing paths, Morvrin appeared, clutching Takima's arm. Perhaps it was for support, though Morvrin was wide enough to make the shorter woman seem more diminutive than she actually was. Perhaps it was to keep Takima from escaping. Morvrin was dogged once she set a goal. Egwene frowned. Morvrin might well be expected to seek out a sitter for her Aja, the Brown, yet Egwene would have thought Janya or Esmeralda more likely. The two passed out of sight behind a canvas-topped wagon on runners, Morvrin bending to talk in her companion's ear. There was no way to tell whether Takima was paying any mind. Is something the matter, Mother? Egwene put on a smile that felt tight. No more than usual, Shiriam. No more than usual. At the Amerlin's study, Shiriam departed to see to the tasks Egwene had given her, and Egwene went in to find everything in readiness. She would have been surprised at anything else. Selene was just setting a tea tray on the writing table. Brightly colored beadwork ran across the rail-thin woman's bodice and down her sleeves, and with her long nose carried high, she hardly seemed a servant at first glance, but she had seen to what needed doing. 2 braziers full of glowing coals had taken some of the chill off the air, though most of the heat rushed out through the smoke hole. Dried herbs sprinkled on the coals gave a pleasant scent to the smoke that did not escape. The tray from the night before was gone, and the lantern and tallow candles had been trimmed and lit. No one was about to leave a tent open enough to let in light from outside. Swan was already there, too, with a stack of papers in her hand, a harried expression on her face, and a smudge of ink on her nose. The post of secretary provided the two of them another reason to be seen talking, and Shiriam had not minded at all giving up the work. Swan herself grumbled frequently, however. For a woman who had seldom left the tower since entering as a novice, she had a remarkable dislike for staying inside. At the moment, she was the picture of a woman being patient and wanting everyone to know it. For all her high nose, Selene simpered and bobbed so many curtsies that taking Egwene's cloak and mittens turned into an elaborate little ceremony. The woman nattered on about the mother putting her feet up, and perhaps she should fetch the mother a lap robe, and maybe she should stay in case the mother wanted anything else, until Egwene practically chased her out. The tea tasted of mint. In this weather, Selene was a trial, and she could hardly be called loyal, but she did try. There was no time for lounging and sipping tea, though. Egwene straightened her stole and took her place behind the writing desk, absent-mindedly giving a yank to the leg of her chair so it would not fold beneath her as it often did. Swan perched atop a rickety stool on the other side of the table, and the tea cooled. They did not speak of plans or Gareth Bryn or hopes. What could be done there for now had been. Reports and problems piled up when they were on the move, and weariness overcame attempts to deal with them, and now that they were stopped, all had to be gone through. An army ahead did not change that. At times, Egwene wondered how so much paper could be found when everything else seemed so difficult. The reports Swan handed her detailed shortages and little else. Not simply those Shiriam had mentioned, but coal and nails and iron for the farriers and wheelwrights, leather and oiled thread for the harness makers, lamp oil and candles, and 100 other things, even soap. And whatever was not running out was wearing out, from shoes to tents, all listed in Swan's bold hand, which grew more aggressive the more glaring the need she wrote about. Her account of the coin remaining looked to have been slashed onto the paper in a positive fury, and not a thing to be done about it. Among Swan's papers were several addresses from sitters suggesting ways to solve the problem of money, or rather informing Egwene what they intended to lay before the hall. There were few advantages to any of the schemes, however, and many pitfalls. Moira Carantanis proposed stopping the soldiers' pay, a notion Egwene thought the hall had already realized would cause the army to melt away like a tree under a midsummer sun. Malind Nachinen presented an appeal to nearby nobles that sounded more a demand, and might well turn the whole countryside against them, as would Salita Toranis' intention to levy a tax on the towns and villages they passed. Crumpling the 3 addresses together in her fist, Egwene shook them at Swan. She wished it were the 3 sitters' throats she was gripping. Do they all think everything has to go the way they wish, and never mind realities? Light! They're the ones behaving like children. The tower has managed to make its wishes become realities often enough, Swan said complacently. Remember, some would say you're ignoring reality too. Egwene sniffed. Luckily, whatever the hall voted, none of the proposals could be carried forward without a decree from her. Even in her straitened circumstances, she had a little power. Very little, but that was more than none. Is the hall always this bad, Swan? Swan nodded, shifting slightly to try to find a better balance. No 2 of her stool's legs were the same length. But it could be worse. Remind me to tell you about the year of the 4 Amerlins. That was about 150 years after the founding of Tar Valon. In those days, the normal workings of the tower nearly rivaled what's happening today. Every hand tried to snatch the tiller if they could. There were actually 2 rival halls of the tower in Tar Valon for part of that year, almost like now. Just about everyone came to grief in the end, including a few who thought they were going to save the tower. Some of them might have, if they hadn't stepped in quicksand. The tower survived anyway, of course. It always does. A great deal of history grew up in over 3,000 years, much suppressed, hidden from all but a few eyes, yet Swan seemed to have every detail at her fingertips. She must have spent a good part of her years in the tower burying herself in those secret histories. Of one thing Egwene was certain. She would avoid Shine's fate if she could, but she would not remain as she was, little better off than Samila Sorenthane. Long before the end of her reign, the most important decision left to Samila's discretion was what dress to wear. She was going to have to ask Swan to tell her about the year of the 4 Amerlins, and she did not look forward to it. The shifting beam of light from the smoke hole in the roof showed morning toward midday, but Swan's stack of papers seemed hardly diminished. Any interruption at all would have been welcome, even premature discovery. Well, maybe not that. "What's next, Swan?" she growled. A flicker of movement caught Arengar's eye, and she peered through the trees toward the army's camp, an obscuring ring around the tents of the Aes Sedai. A line of wagon sledges was moving slowly east, escorted by men on horseback. The pale sun glinted from armor and the points of lances. She could not help sneering. Spears and horses. A primitive rabble that could move no faster than a man could walk, led by a man who did not know what was happening 100 miles away. Aes Sedai? She could destroy the lot of them, and even dying they would never suspect who was killing them. Of course, she would not survive them long. That thought made her shiver. The Great Lord gave very few a second chance at life, and she was not about to throw away hers. Waiting until the riders moved out of sight into the forest, she started back toward the camp, thinking idly of tonight's dreams. Behind her, smooth snow would hide what she had buried until the spring thaw, more than long enough. Ahead, some of the men in the camp finally noticed her and straightened from their tasks to watch. In spite of herself, she smiled and smoothed her skirt over her hips. It was difficult now to really remember what life had been like as a man. Had she been such an easily manipulated fool then? Getting through that swarm with a corpse unseen had been difficult, even for her, but she enjoyed the walk back. The morning went on in a seemingly endless wading through paper until what Egwene had known would happen did. Certain daily events were sure. There would be bitter cold, there would be snow, there would be clouds and gray skies and wind, and there would be visits from Lelaine and Ramonda. Weary of sitting, Egwene was stretching her legs when Lelaine swept into the tent with Phaelane at her heels. Frigid air rolled in with them before the tent flap fell shut. Looking around with a faintly disapproving air, Lelaine plucked off blue leather gloves, while allowing Phaelane to remove the lynx-lined cloak from her shoulders. Slender and dignified in deep blue silk, with penetrating eyes, she might have been in her own tent. At a casual gesture, Phaelane retreated deferentially to a corner with the garment, merely shrugging her own cloak back. Plainly, she was ready to go on the instant at another wave of the sitter's hand. Her dark features wore a cast of resigned meekness, not very much like her. Lelaine's reserve cracked for a moment in a surprisingly warm smile for Swan. They had been friends once, years ago, and she had even offered something like the patronage that Phaelane had accepted, a sitter's protection and sheltering arm against the sneers and accusations of other sisters. Touching Swan's cheek, Lelaine softly murmured something that sounded sympathetic. Swan blushed, a startling uncertainty flashing across her face. It was not pretense, Egwene was sure. Swan found it difficult to deal with what really had changed in her, and more, with how easily she was adapting. Lelaine eyed the stool in front of the writing table, and, as usual, visibly rejected such an unsteady seat. Only then did she acknowledge Egwene's presence, with the barest dip of her head. "We need to speak of the sea folk, Mother," she said, in a tone a bit firm to be directed at the Amerlin's seat. Not until Egwene's heart sank down from her throat did she realize she had been afraid that Lelaine already knew what Lord Bryn had told her, or even the meeting he was arranging. The next instant, her heart leaped back again. The sea folk? Surely the Hall could not have learned of the insane bargain Nynaeve and Elaine had made. She could not imagine what had led them into such a disaster, or how she was to deal with it. Her stomach roiling, she took her place behind the table without revealing anything of what she felt. And that fool chair leg folded, nearly dropping her onto the puffs before she could get straight again. She hoped her cheeks were not coloring. The sea folk in Caemlyn or in Cairhien? Yes, that sounded suitably calm and collected. Cairhien, Romanda's high voice rang like sudden chimes. Definitely Kyrian. Her entry made Lelaine seem almost diffident, the force of her personality abruptly filling the tent. There was no warm smile to Romanda. Handsome as her face was, it did not seem made for them. Theodrin followed her in, and Romanda swung her cloak off with a flourish and tossed it to the slim, apple-cheeked sister with a peremptory gesture that sent Theodrin hurrying to a corner opposite Phaelane. Phaelane was distinctly subdued, but Theodrin's tilted eyes were very wide, as though she was permanently startled, and her lips seemed ready to gasp. Like Phaelane, her proper place in the hierarchy of Aes Sedai demanded better employment, but neither was likely to receive it soon. Romanda's compelling gaze rested a moment on Swan, as if considering whether to send her to a corner as well, then brushed past Lelaine almost dismissively before settling on Egwene. It seems that young man has been talking with the sea folk, Mother. The yellow eyes and ears in Kyrian are most excited about it. Do you have any idea what might interest him in the Atha'an-Mier? Despite the title, Romanda hardly sounded as if she were addressing the Amerlin seat, but then she never did. There was no doubt who that young man was. Every sister in the camp accepted that Rand was a dragon-born, but anyone who heard them talk would have believed they were speaking of an unruly young lout who might come to dinner drunk and throw up on the table. She can hardly know what's in the boy's head, Lelaine said before Egwene could open her mouth. Her smile was not at all warm this time. If an answer is to be found, Romanda, it will be in Camelin. The Atha'an-Mier there are not sequestered on a ship, and I seriously doubt that high-ranking seafolk came so far from the sea on different errands. I've never heard of them doing so for any reason. It may be they have an interest in him. They must know who he is by now. Romanda smiled back, and frost should have appeared on the tent walls. There's hardly need to state the obvious, Lelaine. The first question is how to find out. I was about to resolve that when you barged in, Romanda. The next time the mother encounters Elaine or Nynaeve in Tel Riod, she can pass on instructions. Marililla can discover what the Atha'an-Mier want, or maybe what the boy does when she reaches Camelin. A pity the girls didn't think to set a regular schedule, but we must work around that. Marililla can meet with a sitter in Tel Riod when she knows. Lelaine made a small gesture. Plainly, she herself was the intended sitter. I thought Salidar might be a suitable place. Romanda snorted with amusement. Even in that, there was no warmth. Easier to instruct Marililla than to see she obeys, Lelaine. I expect she knows she faces sharp questions. This bowl of the winds should have been brought to us for study first. None of the sisters in Ebudar had much ability in cloud dancing, I believe, and you can see the result, all this hurly-burly and suddenness. I have a thought to call a question before the hall concerning everyone involved. Abruptly, the gray-haired woman's voice became smooth as butter. As I recall, you supported the choice of Marililla. With a jerk, Lelaine drew herself up. Her eyes flashed. I supported who the Grey put forward, Romanda, and no more, she said indignantly. How could I have imagined she would decide to use the bowl there, and to include sea folk wilders in the circle? How could she believe they know as much of working weather as Aes Sedai? Abruptly, her ire slipped. She was defending herself to her fiercest adversary in the hall, her only real adversary, and, no doubt worse in her view, she was agreeing with her about the sea folk. There was no question that she did agree, but giving the fact voice was another matter. Romanda let her cold smile deepen as Lelaine's face paled with fury. She straightened her bronze-colored skirts with meticulous care as Lelaine searched for a way to turn matters about. We will see how the hall stands, Lelaine, she said finally. Until the question is called, I think it best if Marililla does not meet with any of the sitters involved in her selection. Even a suggestion of collusion would be looked at askance. I'm sure you will agree I should be the one to speak with her. Lelaine's face paled differently. She was not afraid, not visibly, Yet Egwene could almost see her counting who might stand for her or against. Collusion was almost as serious as a charge of treason, and required only the lesser consensus. Likely she could avoid that, but the arguments would be deep and acrimonious. Romanda's faction might even increase. That would cause untold problems, whether or not Egwene's own plans bore fruit. And there was nothing she could do to stop it, short of revealing what really had happened in Ebudar. As well ask them to let her accept the same offer Feolain and Theodrin had. Egwene drew breath. At least she might be able to prevent the use of Salidar as a meeting place in Tel Aran'rhiod. That was where she met Elaine and Nynaeve now. When she did, anyway. She had not in days. With sitters popping in and out of the world of dreams, finding anywhere you could be sure they would not appear was difficult. The next time I encounter Elaine or Nynaeve, I will pass on your instructions regarding Marililla. I can let you know when she's ready to meet you, which would be never, once she was done with those instructions. The sitters' heads whipped around, and two sets of eyes stared at her. They had forgotten she was there. Struggling to keep her face smooth, she realized her foot was tapping irritably and stopped it. She had to go along with what they thought of her a while longer yet. A little while longer. At least she no longer felt nauseated, just angry. Into that moment of silence, Chesa came bustling with Egwene's midday meal on a cloth-covered tray. Dark-haired, plump, and pretty in her middle years, Chesa managed to convey a proper respect without cringing. Her curtsy was as simple as her dark gray dress, with just a touch of plain lace at the throat. "Forgive me for intruding, Mother," Aes Sedai. "I am sorry this is late, Mother, but Mary seems to have wandered off." She clicked her tongue in exasperation as she set the tray in front of Egwene. Wandering seemed very unlike the misnamed Mary. That dour woman was as disapproving of faults in herself as she was of those in others. Romanda frowned, but she said nothing. After all, she could hardly show too much interest in one of Egwene's maids, especially when the woman was her spy, just as Selene was Lelaine's. Egwene avoided looking at Theodrin or Feolain, both still standing dutifully in their corners like accepted, rather than Aes Sedai themselves.
Give me one
Chesa
second,
half
everyone. I'll
opened her
be
mouth,
right
but
back.
closed it again, perhaps intimidated by the sitters. Egwene was relieved when she dipped another curtsy and left with a murmured, "By your leave, Mother." Chase's advice was always indirect enough for any sister when anyone else was present. But right then, the last thing Egwene wanted was even a circumspect reminder to eat while her food was hot. Lelaine took up as if there had been no interruption. "The important thing," she said firmly, "is to learn what the Atha Anmir want, or what the boy does. Maybe he wants to be their king, too." Holding out her arms, she allowed Feolain to restore her cloak, which the dark young woman did with care. "You will remember to let me know if you have any thoughts on it, Mother?" That was just barely a request. "I will think hard," Egwene told her, which was not to say she would share her thoughts. She wished she had a glimmer of the answer. That the Atha Anmir believed Rand was their prophesied Kuramor, she knew, though the Hall did not. But what he wanted from them, or them from him, she could not begin to imagine. According to Elaine, the sea folk with them had no clue, or said not. Egwene almost wished one of the handful of sisters who had come from the Atha Anmir was in the camp. Almost. One way or another, those windfinders were going to cause trouble. At a wave of Romanda's hand, Theodrin leaped forward with the sitter's cloak as though goosed. By Romanda's expression, Lelaine's recovery did not best please her. "You will remember to tell Marililla I wish to speak with her, Mother," she said, and that was not a request at all. For a brief moment the two sitters stood staring at one another, Egwene forgotten again in their mutual animosity. They departed without a word to her, very nearly jostling for precedence before Romanda slipped out first, drawing Theodrin in her wake. Baring her teeth, Lelaine practically pushed Feolain from the tent ahead of her. Swan heaved a hearty sigh and made no attempt to hide her relief. By your leave, mother, Egwene muttered mockingly. If you please, mother, you may go, daughters. Letting out a long breath, she settled back in her chair, which promptly pitched her onto the carpets in a heap. She picked herself up slowly and jerked her skirts straight, put her stole to right. At least it had not happened in front of those two. Go get something to eat, Swan, and bring it back. We've a long day yet. Some falls hurt less than others, Swan said as if to herself before ducking outside. It was a good thing she went so quickly, or Egwene might have given her an earful. She returned soon, though, and they ate hard rolls and lentil stew laced with tough carrot and scraps of meat Egwene did not look at closely. There were only a few interruptions, intrusions where they fell silent and pretended to study reports. Chesa came to take away the tray, and later to replace the candles, a task she grumbled over, which was not like her. Who'd expect Selene to go missing too, she muttered, half to herself. Off canoodling with the soldiers, I expect. That Helena's a bad influence. A skinny young fellow with a dripping nose renewed the already dead coals in the braziers. The Amerlin got more warmth than most, but that was not a great deal. And he stumbled over his own boots and gaped at Egwene in a manner quite gratifying after the two sitters. Shiriam appeared to ask whether Egwene had any further instructions of all things, and then seemed to want to stay. Perhaps the few secrets she knew made her nervous. Her eyes certainly darted uneasily. That was the lot, and Egwene was not sure whether it was because no one bothered the Amerlin without cause, or because everyone knew the real decisions were made in the hall. I don't know about this report of soldiers moving south out of Kandor, Swan said as soon as the tent flap fell behind Shiriam. There's just the one, and borderlanders seldom go far from the Blight, but every fool knows that, so it's hardly the kind of tale anyone would make up. She was not reading from a page now. Swan had managed to keep very tenuous control of the Amerlin's network of eyes and ears so far, and reports, rumors, and gossip flowed to her in steady streams, to be studied before she and Egwene decided what to pass on to the hall. Lyanna had her own network to add to the flow. Most of it was passed on. Some things the hall had to know, and there was no guarantee that the Ajahs would pass on what their own agents learned. But it all had to be sieved for what might be dangerous, or serve to divert attention from the real goal. Few of those streams carried anything good of late. Kyrian had produced any number of rumors of Aes Sedai allied with Rand, or worse, serving him, yet at least those could be dismissed out of hand. The wise ones would not say much at all about Rand or anyone connected to him, but according to them, Marana was awaiting his return, and certainly Sisters in the Sun Palace, where the Dragon Reborn kept his first throne, were more than seed enough to grow those tales. Others were not easily ignored, even when it was hard to know what to make of them. A printer in Ilion asserted that he had proof Rand had killed Matin Stepaneos with his own hands and destroyed the body with the one power. Aboard a ship that had sailed. The first was far more likely. One of the Ajah's agents had picked up the same tale. There were all against Rand's name in the sisters' books. It went on like that. The Shan-Chan seemed to be taking a firm hold in Ebu Dar against very little resistance. That might have been expected in a land where the Queen's true rule ended a few days' ride from her capital, yet it was hardly heartening. The Shido seemed to be everywhere, though word of them always came from someone who had heard from someone who had heard. Most sisters seemed to believe the scattered Shido were Rand's work, despite the Wise One's denials, carried by Shiriam. No one wanted to probe the Wise One's supposed lies too closely, of course. There were 100 excuses, but no one was willing to meet them in Tel Iran-Riod except the sisters sworn to Egwene, and they had to be ordered. Anaya dryly called the encounters quite compact lessons in humility, and she did not seem at all amused. There can't be that many Shido, Egwene muttered. No herbs had been added to the second batch of charcoal, which was dying down in faint embers, and her eyes ached from the smoke that hung thin in the air. Channeling to get rid of it would disperse the last warmth, too. Some of this must be bandits' work. After all, who could tell a village emptied by people fleeing brigands from one emptied by Shido, especially at third hand or fifth? There are certainly enough bandits around to account for some of it, most calling themselves Dragonsworn, which was no help at all. She worked her shoulders to loosen a few of the knots in her muscles. Abruptly, she realized that Swan was staring at nothing so intently that she appeared ready to slip off of her stool. "Swan, are you falling asleep? We may have worked most of the day, but it's still light out." There was light at the smoke hole, though it did appear to be fading. Swan blinked. "I'm sorry. I've been thinking about something lately and trying to decide whether to share it with you. About the hall." "The hall? Swan, if you know something about the hall—" "I don't know anything," Swan cut in. "It's what I suspect." She clicked her tongue in annoyance. "Not even suspect, really. At least I don't know what to suspect. But I see a pattern." "Then you had best tell me about it," Egwene said. Swan had shown herself very skilled at detecting patterns where others saw only a jumble. Shifting on her stool, Swan leaned forward intently. "It's this. Aside from Romanda and Moria, the sitters chosen in Salidar they're too young." Much had changed in Swan, but speaking of other sisters' ages clearly made her uncomfortable. "Esmeralda is the oldest, and I'm sure she isn't much past 70. I can't be certain without going into the novice books in Tarvalin or her telling us, but I'm as sure as I can be. It isn't often the hall has held more than one sitter under 100, and here we have 9. "But Romanda and Moria are new," Egwene said gently, resting her elbows on the table. It had been a long day. "And neither is young. Maybe we should be grateful the others are, or they might not have been willing to raise me." She could have pointed out that Swan himself had been chosen Amerlin at less than half Esmeralda's age, but the reminder would have been cruel. "Maybe," Swan said stubbornly. "Romanda was certain for the hall as soon as she showed up. I doubt there's a yellow would dare speak against her for a chair. And Moria, she doesn't cling to Lilane, but Lilane and Lirella probably thought she would. I don't know. Mark me, though. When a woman is raised too young, there's a reason." She took a deep breath, "including when I was." The pain of loss flashed across her face. The loss of the Amerlin seat, certainly. Maybe of all the losses she had suffered. It was gone almost as soon as it came. Egwene did not think she had ever known a woman as strong as Swan Sanche. "This time there were more than enough sisters of proper age to choose from, and I can't see 5 Ajahs deadlocking on all of them. There is a pattern, and I mean to pick it out." Egwene did not agree. Change hung in the air whether Swan wanted to see it or not. Elida had broken custom, come very close to breaking law in usurping Swan's place. Sisters had fled the tower and let the world know of it, and that last certainly had never happened before. Change. Older sisters were more likely to be tied to the old ways, but even some of them had to see that everything was shifting. Surely that was why younger women, more open to the new, had been chosen. Should she order Swan to stop wasting her time with this? Swan had enough else to do. Or would it be a kindness to let her continue? She wanted so deeply to prove that the change she saw was not really occurring at all. Before Egwene could make a decision, Romanda ducked into the tent and stood holding the tent flap open. Long shadows stretched across the snow outside. Evening was coming fast. Romanda's face was as dark as those shadows. She fixed Swan with a stern gaze and snapped one word. "Out!" Egwene gave an infinitesimal nod, but Swan was already on her feet. She missed a step, then all but ran from the tent. Any sister who stood where Swan did was expected to obey any sister of Romanda's strength and the power, not just a sitter. Throwing down the tent flap, Romanda embraced the source. The glow of Saidar surrounded her, and she wove a ward against eavesdropping around the inside of the tent without so much as a pretense of asking Egwene's permission. "You are a fool," she grated. "How long did you think you could keep this a secret? Soldiers talk, child. Men always talk. You'll be lucky if the Hall doesn't put his head on a pike." Egwene stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. She had been waiting for this, but she still needed to be careful. The game was far from played out, and everything could still turn against her in a flash. She had to pretend innocence until she could afford to stop pretending. "Must I remind you that rudeness to the Amerlin seat is a crime, daughter," she said instead. She had been pretending so long, and she was so close. "The Amerlin seat." Romanda strode across the carpets to within arm's reach of Egwene, and by her glare the thought of reaching more crossed her mind. "You're an infant. Your bottom still remembers the last switching it had as a novice. After that, you'll be lucky if the Hall doesn't put you in a corner with a few play pretties. If you want to avoid that, you will listen to me and do as I tell you. Now sit down." Egwene seethed inside, but she sat. It was too soon. With a sharp, satisfied nod, Romanda planted her fists on her hips. She stared down at Egwene like a stern aunt lecturing a misbehaving niece. A very stern aunt, or a headsman with a toothache. "This meeting with Pelivar and Arathel has to go forward now it's been arranged. They expect the Amerlin seat, and they will see her. You will attend with all the pomp and dignity your title deserves, and you will tell them I am to speak for you, after which you will hold your tongue. Getting them out of our way will require a firm hand and someone who knows what she's about. No doubt Lilane will be here any minute, trying to put herself forward, but you just remember the trouble she's in. I've spent the day speaking with other sitters, and it appears very likely that Marilala and Mirana's failures will be quite firmly attached to Lilane when the Hall sits next. So if you have any hope of gaining the experience you'll need to grow into that stole, it lies with me. Do you understand me?" "I understand perfectly," Egwene said, in what she hoped was a meek voice. If she let Romanda speak in her place, there would no longer be any doubts. The Hall and the whole world would know who held Egwene Alvear by the scruff of her neck. Romanda's eyes seemed to bore into her head before the woman gave a curt nod. "I hope that you do. I intend to remove Elida from the Amerlin seat, and I won't see that ruined because a child thinks she knows enough to find her way across the street without her hand held." With a snort, she flung her cloak around her and flung herself out of the tent. The ward vanished as she did. Egwene sat and frowned at the tent's entrance. A child? Burn the woman, she was the Amerlin seat. Whether they liked it or not, they had raised her, and they were going to have to live with it. Eventually. Snatching up the stone inkwell, she hurled it at the tent flap. Lilane dodged back, barely avoiding the splash. "Temper, temper," she chided, coming on in. No more asking permission than Romanda had, she embraced the source and wove a ward to stop anyone overhearing what she had to say. Where Romanda had been in a fury, Lilane appeared pleased with herself, rubbing her gloved hands and smiling. "I don't suppose I need tell you your little secret is out. Very bad of Lord Britain, but I think he's too valuable to kill. A good thing for him, I do. Let me see. I suppose Romanda told you that there will be a meeting with Pelivar and Arathel, but you are to let her do all the talking. Am I right?" Egwene stirred, but Lilane waved a hand at her. "No need to answer. I know Romanda. Unfortunately for her, I learned about this before she did, and instead of running to you straight away, I've been polling the other sitters. Do you want to know what they think?" Egwene balled her fists in her lap, where she hoped they would not be noticed. "I expect you're going to tell me." "You're in no position to take that tone with me," Lilane said sharply, but the next instant her smile returned. "The Hall is displeased with you. Very displeased. Whatever Romanda has threatened you with, and it's easy enough to imagine, I can deliver. Romanda, on the other hand, has upset a number of sitters with her bullying. So unless you want to find yourself with less authority than the little you have now, Romanda is going to be surprised tomorrow when you name me to speak for you. It's hard to believe Arathel and Pelavar were foolish enough to put a thing like this in motion, but they'll slink away with their tails between their legs once I'm done with them. How do I know you won't carry out those threats anyway? Egwene hoped her angry mutter sounded like sullenness. Liked, but she was tired of this. Because I say I won't, Lilane snapped. Don't you know by now that you aren't really in charge of anything? The Hall is, and that is between Romanda and me. In another 100 years you may grow into the stole, but for now, sit quietly, fold your hands, and let someone who knows what she is about see to pulling Elida down. After Lilane left, Egwene once more sat staring. This time she was not letting anger boil. You may grow into the stole. Almost the same thing Romanda had said. Someone who knows what she is about. Was she deceiving herself? A child, ruining what a woman with experience could handle easily? Swan slipped into the tent and stood looking worried. Gareth Bryn just came to tell me the Hall knows, she said dryly, under cover of asking about his shirts. Him and his bloody shirts. The meeting is set for tomorrow at a lake about 5 hours to the north. Pelavar and Arathel are already on the way. Aemlyn, too. That's a third strong house. That's more than Lilane or Romanda saw fit to tell me, Egwene said just as dryly. No. 100 years of being led by the hand, pushed by the scruff of her neck, or 50 years or 5, and she would be fit for nothing more. If she had to grow, she had to grow now. Oh, blood and bloody ashes, Swan groaned. I can't stand it. What did they say? How did it go? About as we expected, Egwene smiled with a wonder that touched her voice, too. Swan, they couldn't have handed me the Hall better if I had told them what to do. The last light was failing as Shiriam approached her tiny tent, smaller even than Egwene's. If she had not been keeper, she would have had to share. Ducking inside, she had only time to realize she was not alone when she was shielded and flung face down on her cot. Stunned, she tried to cry out, but a corner of one of her blankets wadded itself into her mouth. Dress and shift burst away from her body like a pricked bubble. A hand stroked her head. You were supposed to keep me informed,
Right
Shiriam.
back.
That girl is up to something, and I want to know what. It took a long time to convince her questioner that she had already told all she knew, that she would never hold back a word, not a whisper. When she was left alone at last, it was to lie curled up and whimpering from her welts, bitterly wishing that she had never in her life spoken to a single sister in the Hall. Chapter 17. Out on the Ice. The next morning, a column rode north from the Aes Sedai camp well before dawn, near silent except for the creak of saddles and the crunch of hooves breaking through the snow's crisp crust. Occasionally a horse snorted, or metal jingled and was quickly muffled. The moon was already down, the sky glistening with stars, but the pale blanket lying over everything below lightened the darkness. When the first glimmers of day appeared in the east, they had been riding a good hour or more, which was not to say they had traveled far. Over some open stretches, Egwene could let Daishar go at a slow canter that sprayed white like splashing water, but for the most part the horses walked, and not quickly, through sparse forest, where the snow made deep drifts below and clung to branches overhead. Oak and pine, sour gum and leatherleaf, and trees she did not recognize all looked even more bedraggled than they had in the heat and drought. Today was the feast of Abram, but there would be no prizes baked in honey cakes. The lights and some people found surprises in the day, though. The sun rose and climbed, a pale golden ball that gave no warmth. Every breath still bit the throat and produced a puff of mist. A sharp wind blew, not hard, but cutting, and to the west, dark clouds rolled north on their way to Andor. She felt a touch of pity for whoever would know the burden of those clouds, and relief that they were heading away. Waiting another day would have been maddening. She had been unable to sleep at all, for fidgety restlessness, not headaches. Restlessness and tendrils of fear that had crept in like cold air under the edges of the tent. She was not tired, though. She felt like a compressed spring, a tight-wound clock, full of energy that wanted desperately to find release. Light, everything could still go horribly wrong. It was an impressive column behind the standard of the White Tower, the white flame of Tar Valon centered on a spiral of 7 colors, one for each Aja. Sewn secretly in Salidar, it had lain in the bottom of a chest ever since, with the keys in the keeping of the hall. She did not think they would have produced it except for this morning's need for pomp. 1,000 heavy cavalry in plate and mail provided a close escort, a panoply of lances, swords, maces, and axes seldom seen south of the borderlands. Their commander was a one-eyed Shinaran with a vividly painted eye patch, a man she had met once, what seemed an age ago. Uno Nomesta glared at the trees through the steel bars of his helmet's face guard, as if he expected every last one to hide an ambush, and his men seemed nearly as watchful, erect in their saddles. Almost out of sight ahead through the trees rode a knot of men who wore helmets, breast and back plates, but no other armor. Their cloaks whipped about freely, a gauntleted hand for the reins and a hand for the short bow they each carried, left nothing to grasp at warmth. There were more farther on, and beyond sight to left and right and behind another 1,000 altogether to scout and screen. Gareth Bryn did not expect trickery from the Andorrans, but he had been wrong before, so he said, and the Mirandians were another matter. And then there was the possibility of assassins in Elida's pay, or even dark friends. The light alone knew when a dark friend might decide to kill, or why. For that matter, though the Shido were supposedly far away, no one ever seemed to know they were there until the killing began. Even bandits might have tried their hand with too small a party. Lord Bryn was not a man to take chances unnecessarily, and Egwene was very glad. Today she wanted as many witnesses as possible. She herself rode ahead of the banner with Shiriam and Swan and...
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone can continue to stop by. Excuse me. But until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.